SJ. Welcome to Mvskoke Radio, your weekly source for tribal and community news, interesting guests and discussions, plus a local events calendar. SJ, Stongo, Gary Fife, Jahu Jeff Gados, Mvskoke Radio, Mambo Hedget Wedskis. You're listening to Mvskoke Radio, a production of Mvskoke Media of the Mvskoke Creek Nation, here in beautiful, hot Okmulgee, Oklahoma. Gary Fife here, as I just said. We have a couple of things we'll be sharing with you. I'll be talking to a good friend and fellow radio producer who I actually got my start in the business with. Laura Waterman Wittstock produces first-person radio and has quite an impressive pedigree to go along with it as an educator and working in philanthropy. Also, in the second half of our program, we'll be talking to Chuck Hoskins from the Cherokee Nation about a new bill governing who is and who isn't an Indian artist here in the state of Oklahoma. And it could be some people who have been saying that they were natives under this bill would not be able to anymore, and maybe cut out of some of the Indian arts and crafts exhibitions and fairs. So we'll be talking to him about that bill and the implications and collateral damage. But first of all, let me introduce you to Laura Waterman Wittstock. She is president and CEO of Wittstock and Associates, on her own firm. It's consultation in new projects, creative development, assessment, evaluation, and governance. Now, it says here a former journalist, but I just can't vision her as a former journalist. She was the head of Mvskoke Communications in Minneapolis, the producers of First Person Radio, one of the earliest Native American radio programs available, and it was on the satellite, probably one of the first. Since then, she's made quite an impact in the Twin Cities community as an author, educator, winners of several major awards, and serves on their library board, I believe, and a couple of other things. But first of all, Laura, are you with me there?
Holy cow. What an introduction.
Where did I hear that?
So much, Gary.
Well, that's just half of what's down here that I could have read, but we thought we'd just get on it and talk with you. Now, for our listeners here on Mvskoke Radio, Laura is the first person I went to work for after I got out of college. I was actually not even out of college. I was placed in an internship with the Indian Legal Information Development Service, an organization that looked at every piece of legislation going through Congress at the time to see if it had some impact on Native Americans. And then later on, we worked together at the American Indian Press Association and have been just, good brothers and sisters ever since then. So first of all, Laura, this is my turn to turn the tables on you. I just spoke with you. First Person Radio was my actual introduction to radio. Why don't you give us a little bit of an idea of what that program was all about?
Well, we wanted to do a magazine format radio show because we were in the midst or just coming out of a recession in the United States, and about half of the Indian newspapers went under because they couldn't attract advertisers to keep them in print. And so I had moved to Minneapolis in 1973 to work for the National Indian Education Association. And in about 1975 or so, I decided to move on and did some consulting work, and a small group of journalists and journalism students were really interested in doing something in American Indian print journalism. And so once we did that analysis of the recession and the effect it had on Indian newspapers, we knew that that wasn't the way to go. the American Indian Press Association, as you know, Gary, went under, and I was the last executive director there in 1975, and then you and Rose Robinson were the individuals that closed down the office, and it was a very sad time. So we didn't want to repeat that and create another news service that was going to be print dependent. So somebody in our group had the bright idea of looking at radio. Well, radio really was not that popular. People had gone to FM and away from AM, but it was, long-form music, very little conversation, certainly not looked at as a news source. And so our very first customer was actually a commercial station, and they put our half-hour show on at about 2 a.m, and we began to have a following among truck drivers who were, of course, up and on the road at that time. And then we went to an hour format in, I believe, 1983, when National Public Radio picked us up on the satellite for distribution. That was a huge, increase in our capacity to reach people nationally. And so we really needed somebody to lead us, and that's when we hired you, Gary, to be our first executive director. And I think of those as the golden years when you were here, because we went into new areas, we developed new funding, we had a lot of support from people. You were very popular around town, and it was just a great time.
Well, gosh, you're really dusting off the cobwebs here for me. I remember all those old AM stations, like you're all listening to a Ray Conniff featurette with 3 or 4 back-to-back Ray Conniff songs. And you're thinking, good Lord, come on, the world is changing, people. And it has so much. You mentioned a couple of things there. The first-person radio was such a trailblazer, and it did a lot of things that were so much different from what was being covered by the mainstream media for Native communities. As we have said, on your program, it was episodic coverage. Perhaps a beautiful powwow or something like that, or drunks on the reservation somewhere, or problems in people not being able to place children in foster care, and that was it. I mean, there was no coverage of the economic development and or change going on among tribal governments. We were putting a generation of young people through college there and beginning to see the impact of that educational background now.
Right.
And First Person Radio covered many of those subjects, and then did a much better job of the cultural aspects too. Like if we're going to a powwow, this is what this song is, and this is what this outfit is, and this is why they do this, and here's what you're not supposed to do. Things like went much further in educating listeners. Then.
Well, one of the things we did, Gary, was to look for people around the country that were moving from print because they were out of work, independent reporters, to become independent producers and submit to us stories from all around the country on, basically public affairs, current issues, and we would buy that from them and then put that into the magazine format. So we really had the advantage of having a lot of people who were all around the country doing work for us instead of having a small staff and trying to do all the heavy lifting ourselves. Some weeks we were kind of thin in terms of what we were getting in. Other weeks we had more time that we could possibly fit into 1 hour.
Right. Now, when I was in Alaska with National Native News, one of the things I had to do was educate the reporters in how to cover an idea. Was that something similar that you experienced in those early days? Did they not know enough about our culture to get it right, or perhaps the background to get the politics right in that particular topic?
Well, going back to even 1972 when Nixon was reelected and the American Indian movement came into Washington, D.C. to occupy the Bureau of Indian Affairs building, at the AIPA, the Indian Press Association, and at ILEDS, the magazine you and I worked at, we got calls from Time Magazine, Newsweek Magazine, the New York Times, the Washington Post, you name it, the who's who of mainstream journalism, asking us to be sources as they went after their news stories. And it really ticked us off because we were, doing background for these major news organizations, but they were going in and producing stories that identified the American Indian movement as Indian militants and, wearing strange clothing and the whole thing was a very, very poor example of mainstream reporting. And that was one of the reasons, I think, that the Indian Press Association, ILEDS, and later on First Person Radio wanted to avoid is becoming just a source for the mainstream media, but producing stories that were authentic from the Indian community itself.
You mentioned the American Indian Press Association. I remember Rose Robinson and I having to close that office down. And the reason, we were gaining popularity and following. People appreciated us, but AIPA could not gain that 501c3 tax exempt status. And therefore, no foundation would touch us. And without any money, we had to shut it down. But its legacy lives on now today in Naja, and our industry has just blossomed, grown by leaps and bounds. I don't know what other superlatives we could throw in there about its change, but we've seen progress in the quality of the productions that are going out, the people who are involved, the areas now that are involved. Now, Twin Cities has always been a hotbed of Native activism and things like that. What do you see in terms of that industry from your perspective there?
Say that again, Gary. I didn't quite get that.
Where are we then and where are we now? We gotten much better at what we're doing?
Oh, absolutely. We are at about 59 American Indian radio stations around the country. Radio is the media source of preference for, thousands and hundreds of thousands of Indian people. They wake up in the morning and they turn on their radio station on their reservation or in their Indian community, and that's their source. And so that calls upon those 59 stations to produce higher quality content for that population, and that means they have to have people who are trained and people who understand how to write for that particular kind of media. And so it's we do have a lot more young people graduating from mass comm and getting degrees and getting internships in mainstream media so that they can go back to their home reservations, and many of them do. And so we really have a growing industry. in terms of our capacity, we are way behind the curve, just as we were back in 1977 when Mvskoke came into being. And one of our goals was to train young people to go into the business. We're still behind the curve, but it's kind of a happy curve to be behind because we have more radio stations than we've ever had in the history of our nation.
Right, I absolutely agree with you there. It's the spoken word. You have to know how people say something. That's every bit as important as what they say.
Right.
And one thing I experienced is many of our people had never heard the voices of those who were in control of our affairs, whether it was our own people or the feds or somebody else. They'd never heard it. And all of a sudden this medium was able to give that to them, and in a much more rapid fashion. Back in the old days when we were back in D.C., it was, tribal newspaper once a month, maybe at best twice a month. And so whatever you got was weeks old. And,
oh, yeah.
And people were saying, darn, I wish I'd have known that ahead of time, and I would have been there and done something about it. But now we can do that. We're saying, okay, well, we've got folks who are quite skilled in the art of monitoring the government and putting these notices out, and then giving us a quality product now to listen to or even watch, in film and television, which is still a wonderful, wonderful medium. But it's a spoken word. It's like, I have spoken kind of thing, and the oral tradition come to life. We've seen all of that happen. You mentioned the new social media in our chat earlier this morning. Now, what's your spin on it? I kind of let you know that yours truly was left behind by a lot of this technology, but dragged kicking and screaming into the computer age. But
Yes.
How do you see it? What do you see though that new technology and the social media as doing for our people?
Well, I remember back in, oh my goodness, I don't know, probably the mid-'90s. I was still using my typewriter, and the rest of my staff had all been trained on the brand new computers. Of course, they were, nothing compared to today. And so one morning I came to work, and my typewriter was gone off of my desk. And that's the way the staff forced me into the computer room to learn how to type on this keyboard.
Oh,
but I'll tell you today, for first-person radio, I'm using Facebook, I'm using Twitter, and of course email is old. Every possible means that I am familiar with, because the issue for everyone in media is capturing the young audience. And young people have less of a taste for traditional journalism, for newspapers, even for television news. I sat at a table for the Minnesota Council of Nonprofits not too long ago, and I thought just for an exercise, I would ask everybody, it was a table of about 12, how many read the newspaper every day? I think there were 2 hands.
Mm-hmm.
How many people watch news on television? I think there were about 5 hands. And how many look at the Internet for their news? I think there are about 3 hands. And so how many don't go to any of these sources? And there were about 6 hands. Half the people at the table, these were all young people, was none of the above for them. And so the question becomes, how do you reach them? And this is a question for the future that I don't know whether we're paying enough attention to.
I was turning that over in my mind as you spoke. Like if you ask them, How many of you know who Edward R. Murrow or Walter Cronkite were?
Oh, yes.
Something like that. And that was our lifeline to the world. This is how we found out what was going on, and now it's it's Fred Flintstone to most of them. And you see so many young people walking around staring at this little machine in their hand and earbuds in, and whatever they're listening to or whatever, and seemingly not connected. What we've managed to achieve, I think, and beginning to appreciate, is the fact that let's put out a much better product and jazz it up if we need to, but keep these products and availabilities out there still. Now, in defense of the printed word, of course, many of our elders and seniors here at Mvskoke Nation prefer the newspaper. We cannot forget those folks and the fact that we need to put out this publication. And it's useful in that you can read it, throw it down, walk away, and come back later this afternoon, pick it up, and read it again. As for what we're doing, it's there and it's gone unless you archive it or something like that. As we think about the growth of our industry, what kind of things do you think, what directions perhaps, or what kind of things do we need to tackle, I think, to keep pace and draw this young people's industry? Are there ideas that you might have?
Well, I've always been interested in following mainstream politics and bringing that into the work that we do. And it has been, quite a long history with trying to do that. And, now we have Mark Trahan, who reports on politics daily. And he does a radio program as well for NAV1. And we just had him on the show last week. And when it comes down to it, with the basic elements, talking is the communication that Indian people understand. And as long as that strong cultural pull is there among the people, radio is going to have a place, because it is storytelling, it is news reporting, it is bringing live, music from powwows and so forth. It is bringing culture into the home or into the car or into the iPhone, whatever it happens to be. Radio is still going to be that strong medium. We just saw the last show for Garrison Keillor and Prairie Home Companion. The show goes on, but with a new host later on. And one of the things Keillor said was that radio is the most, fragile of all of them. It's here today and dust tomorrow. And that may be true in a sense, but I disagree in that content lives on in the Internet. And our show, for example, is carried online, as is your show, and then it's archived, and people can access it through Mvskoke Communications from now, as long as we have the capacity to provide that digital information. And so I'm very optimistic about the future of radio in that sense.
We have attended NAJA, Native American Journalists Association convention, a couple of years back, and you and I have been through several of them. But the last one I was at, I was just amazed and floored by the diversity of tribes represented, the kinds of vehicles were being used, everything from print and magazines up through radio programming and special series and features and things, and then television, just boom, it was everywhere. And of course, people doing webcasts and things like that. Are we keeping pace, do you think? Gosh, I can't even speak. The young folks that we're looking at now who weren't even born when you and I were kicking it around back in D.C. now are award-winning producers now and things like that. So is that a bright horizon?
Right. The millennials didn't start being born until, somewhere close to the mid-'80s. And there was historic things that happened in the 1970s, over 10 years before they were born. And so, it's a challenge because they are the resources for the future. In many ways, they are the ones that will carry the culture forward. And it is, we entrust so much to them. And once in a while, it's interesting, like as you say, to go to places like Naja and just sit in the back and listen to all that talent coming forward. It kind of makes you feel good. Like, okay, I think we did our part.
Yeah, we blazed that trail. Now, speaking as one journalistic elder to another, do you? Here's what I guess I'm trying to say. Sometimes in our newsroom, there's a bunch of kids. For me, they're kids. All under 40. One of them actually just turned 20. I was like, good Lord, I'm 3 times this girl's age. And they will sometimes, stop and turn to me for a history lesson, if you will, or as a resource, kind of wanting to know the background on something. Well, you were in D.C. when 93-638 was passed. Tell me what happened there. I said, oh, well, back in the old days, I remember when we were... do you get called on like that as a resource? As I was once called Yoda here. Do you ever get any of that from the folks up there?
Well, what I do get, and mainly from the non-Indian world, is people want to know about my life. And they want to know. How did Mega get started? And so I become sort of a historian, and it's a big responsibility. But on the other hand, it can make me, question our ability to understand history. We don't. And as a people, as all of us, particularly Americans, have such a sense of privilege that when they try to understand Indian people, they just don't know where to start. And it is either from a sense of oh, well, you must be one of the exceptions. I'm not. Or, you must know everything there is to know about Indian people. I don't. And and so that's part of it. What I really enjoy is being in a audience of other Indian people. Mm-hmm. And I feel much more comfortable. I feel much more, willing to share what I know with them. So there really is a difference between the two.
Yes, and an Indian audience gets the jokes.
Yes.
Laura, it's been wonderful. I'd love to keep going here, but we've got another segment we've got to get to. Laura Waterman Wittstock, Seneca from the Cattaraugus Reservation, has been our guest here in the first part of Mvskoke Radio. We appreciate you your experience and your being there, and you were the one that taught me, so I have to give you credit.
Oh, well.
Anyway. Oh, shucks.
Yeah, whatever.
Okay, well, we're going to say goodbye to you. I'll catch up with you later. We'll continue this chat at some point. Okay, thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right, we're going to take a short pause here, and then we'll be back with our second segment here on Mvskoke Radio. We'll be speaking to Chuck Hoskins, I believe the Secretary of Interior for the Cherokee Nation, about the new Indian Arts and Crafts law that affects Oklahoma. So stay with us here on Mvskoke Radio, here on 1240 The Brew.
Hear that? That's the sound of Hope being killed by meth. Methamphetamine use is causing huge problems in our community. Hear that? That's the sound of something you can do about it. Events like rodeo, res ball, and family time can help keep kids away from meth.
Talk to your kids. Keep our culture alive. A message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America and the National Congress of American Indians.
Learn more at ncai.org.
Who am I? Am I Native? I don't want people assuming things because I'm Indian. I just want to be me. But how do I live in two worlds? Some guys just check out by doing meth. But that ain't for me. Because I see my family, my friends, my drum making, my future. There are a lot of cool things about being who I am. And meth isn't one of them.
Learn more at ncai.org. A message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America and the National Congress of American Indians.
We're back here on Mvskoke Radio. Gary Fife, Jaho Jifkadas. I have on the line with me now Mr. Chuck Hoskins with the Cherokee Nation. Now, Mr. Hoskins, first of all, let's get this clear. There are a couple of Chuck Hoskins, is that correct?
There are at least a couple of Chuck Hoskins running around. First of all, OCO, and I'm glad to be with you. I'm Chuck Hoskins Jr. I'm Secretary of State of the Cherokee Nation. Chuck Hoskins Sr. is Chief of Staff of the Cherokee Nation. He is also a member of the Oklahoma Legislature.
Okay, that's where we heard it. Well, OCO Tohija. And we want to talk about the House Bill 2261 that was, I believe, passed and approved by the governor in June. It's titled the American Indian Arts and Sales Act of 1974, modifying definitions, and that's the key phrase right there. First of all, let's just start with the basics. This bill changes the way people can identify as an Indian artist here within the state of Oklahoma. Is that correct?
That's correct. It makes a significant change, whereas under the law before this change, a person who was not a member of a federally recognized tribe could claim to be an Indian for the purposes of marketing his or her art. Under this law, if you're going to produce and sell art in the state of Oklahoma and call it Indian art or native-made art, you've got to be an Indian. You've got to be a member of a federally recognized tribe, and we think that was an important change to the law and a needed change to the law.
Now, does this have any impact or effect at all on the federal legislation or federal law?
It doesn't. Certainly there is a federal Indian Arts and Crafts law, and it has a broader definition of what an Indian is. States, though, certainly retain the right to govern sales of merchandise within their borders to some extent, and we think that certainly the state of Oklahoma can make a public policy decision as to how people display and market their artwork. I think that's certainly within the rights of the state of Oklahoma. So it's true we have a federal law that's a broader definition, but nothing prevented the state of Oklahoma from having what we think is a more precise and accurate definition of what it means to be an Indian.
Now, we'll explore that topic in a little more depth here in just a second, but let me ask you this now. We were discussing sales, and you mentioned sales. Now, we're talking about someone who attends an Indian Arts and Crafts show and sets up a booth, or are we talking about a larger retail merchant? Obviously something like Super Nas up in Osage Country, I believe, is easily identifiable, but the recently closed Lyons Indian store was owned by non-Indians, and
Sure.
Who is affected there?
I think it's all of the above. Anywhere that the state would have jurisdiction over the sale of art with its borders, whether it's at some market or at some Walmart, that matter. Or, for example, in the state capitol, where during our effort to push this legislation, I walked into the Capitol gift shop and found some art produced by, it was lovely art, and it was produced by someone that identified as a member of the Newachota Cherokees. Well, that's not a federally recognized tribe, and so that's really highlighted for me one of the problems. But whether it's a small art show or a big retail shop, this law applies to the extent the state has jurisdiction.
And now we understand the phrase federally recognized tribe is critical here, right?
Yes.
Okay, and so if you aren't an enrolled member, like an official member of that tribe, then you obviously can't claim citizenship in that tribe, even though there may be some ancestry there, right?
Absolutely correct.
If we recall correctly, there are a number of Native people who have heritage from multiple tribes. Somebody might be a Kiowa, Apache, Comanche, or Creek and Cherokee, as in my case, or even a further mix than that. What effect would it have on people who have a multiple tribal heritage there?
I think if they're a citizen or member of any of those federally recognized tribes, then they can continue to market their art as Indian art, Indian-made or native art. If they are not, then they cannot do that. And sort of an important point that sometimes gets lost in the discussion is that no one's preventing someone that's of Indian descendancy but is not also a citizen from marketing, distributing, trading, selling their arts, producing their art. This is simply a question of what's the appropriate label to put on that art. And for artists who are citizens of federally recognized tribes to compete in a marketplace where people who are not citizens just struck us as unfair. And so this sort of corrects that, if you will.
One of the things we've seen in, I guess, practically all my career is that many people will claim Indian heritage, and 9 out of 10 times it's going to be Cherokee. And,
that's true.
The usual, we were so poor that my grandparents gave the child away to these white people who raised the child, or they didn't want to be enrolled and be ruled by the government, so they ran away to the hills, or a collection of stories that are less believable, even more than that. So it seemed like the Cherokee Nation and Cherokee people were kind of almost a target of people who were claiming heritage but could not prove it. Now, was this a reaction to that sort of situation?
I think that was a big part of it, and probably because of the size of our tribe, population-wise, largest tribe in the United States, 330,000 citizens, and of course all the tribes have great histories. We think we have a great history and heritage and culture, and so we probably were a bit more sensitive to, as I going into an art or a gift shop and seeing someone with the quote Newachota Cherokees selling their art. Certainly that hit home for us, but broadly speaking, we live in a state where there are, 37, 38 federally recognized tribes, and that means something in this state, and it's something that those tribes are proud of, and it's also something I think in this day and age the state is increasingly proud of, and they recognize the value of the great partnerships they have with these federally recognized tribes. So we thought it was appropriate in this state, at this time in our history, that the state ought to express what we think is a sound public policy, which is that if you're going to label art as Indian art, well, you better be an Indian.
Well, taking that a step further, is it an effort to get rid of some of the frauds, then, the charlatans out there who are making these claims?
Well, we think that it will affect that. I mean, when someone fraudulently poses as a Cherokee, I mean, that probably most Cherokees, all Cherokees would agree, it offends us on some level. But particularly if you're an artist who've led your life in a way that you learned your craft, you've taught your craft, and you're producing art, and you're doing something that perhaps a generation or two before you were maybe the folks that came before you didn't have that opportunity. So you're finally doing it in a very meaningful way for your people, and to see someone come across that is just just a fake, just a fraud, it really undermines that effort. And so, yeah, it's to address the folks that are, the so-called fakes, but I think it's also to protect the great work of our Indian artists.
One of the things I noticed in an article on this new law was that it could have a real impact on folks who've lived a life as a Native person. Now, what comes to mind is the Uchis here. They have close ties here with the Mvskoke people. Language, clans, traditional ceremonies, a heritage that's quite strong, and yet they are not on the list of federally recognized tribes. That's gonna hurt somebody. I would assume economically, but also in terms of heritage and things like that. I guess we're talking about collateral impact. Would that damage? Was that thought about and discussed in the work on this legislation?
Well, certainly we thought about the impact, but at the end of the day, there's a process for federal recognition. It's a uniform process across the United States, and it's something that any group that considers itself to be a tribe can avail itself of. And so we don't discourage any group from using that process, but we also recognize it's a very rigorous process, and necessarily so. It means something to be an Indian. It means something to be an Indian tribe, and that standard is very high, and we think the federal recognition standard is not just the gold standard of recognition, but it's really the only standard of recognition.
Well, I poked around a little bit and understood that there are like 200 groups around the nation claiming themselves as a Cherokee tribe, like, the East Bohonks of Oregon, or, right, the greater Cherokee Nation of the lower part of Florida, or something like that.
Sure.
Some of these ridiculous names. Now, I presume they would all be dismissed from participation under the law?
Yeah, they certainly, their members, if you want to call them members, certainly could not call their art Indian-made art. And that's, of course, a good thing, because there's plenty of great Cherokee artists in this state producing great art. And as people come through the marketplace and say, I want to purchase Cherokee art, they ought to know that it's genuine. They ought to know that they're not getting ripped off by some fraud who's decided that they can make a buck off our good name. And it's, of course, not just Cherokees. It happens in other tribes, too, but we're particularly sensitive of it because, as you note, it's something that comes up all across the country, folks who say that the Cherokee that really have no legitimate claim, and even more damaging, the groups who claim to be a Cherokee that don't have a legitimate claim.
What about the legislative path? When this bill was introduced in the House and then later in the Senate, did you meet any opposition or discussion from anyone?
There was some really good questions by members of both the House and the Senate, and so just by way of background, this bill was introduced by my father, State Rep. Hoskins, a few years back, and it made it out of the House, did not get a vote in the Senate. This time around, we made a concerted effort to engage members of the House and the Senate on the issue. So it made it through the House, and when it got to the Senate, we did get some good questions about some of the things that you've raised, which is what's the collateral impact? What does it do to the marketplace? Some folks in the legislature asked questions about, is it the role of the government of the state of Oklahoma to go into the marketplace and make these distinctions? And fortunately, the prevailing sentiment is that when it comes to Native art in the state of Oklahoma, it is something that we all ought to celebrate and we all ought to treasure. And the state has an interest in helping the tribes protect their artists, and I think that's good. I think we are in an era where we have some good partnerships with the state. I think that reflects that. So at the end of the day, those questions about should government have a role in this, what's going to be the impact on people who claim to be descendants of tribal members, but they are not themselves citizens, those yielded to the very persuasive arguments that we made that this is what is right for the great Indian artists in this state, and that both the state and the tribes have an interest in its enactment. And so we had it passed overwhelmingly in the Senate as well, unanimously in the House, and with just very few dissenting votes in the Senate.
Do you think this will possibly intensify the arguments over blood quantums and eligibility for memberships in tribes?
Oh, I suppose it could in terms of eligibility. Even some of the questions that were raised about folks who have, claims of descendancy from tribal member, but they're not themselves citizens. Our response to that was, the tribes have a right as a sovereign to determine who their citizens are, and that right is found in tribal law and to some extent federal law. And so it probably will raise some discussions among some folks and some tribes about how they become citizens. But this legislation, of course, is not designed to dictate that. Whether it sparks discussion on that, I can't say for sure, but I suspect that there will be some discussion that arises out of it. When you have artists who have claimed to be Indian, labeled their art as Indian, suddenly they can't do that legally in the state of Oklahoma anymore. They may knock on the door of their tribal legislator and say, hey, let's revisit the citizenship status here. We're very comfortable with the Cherokee Nation with how we determine citizenship. We're very comfortable with no blood quantum. We think that's the best arrangement for Cherokee society. Other tribes view it differently. We understand, but each tribe has the right to make those decisions.
Right. I was thinking tribes like I think it's the Hopi that to become a member you have to have at least half Hopi ancestry there. Very strong cultural ties. And the membership in Cherokee Nation is tied to the Dawes Rules, correct?
Sure. It's descendants from the Dawes Rules without respect to blood quantum.
Right, and I'm sure that blood quantum will raise an issue here and there. Does this law contain any penalties, and what about enforcement?
Well, enforcement is something we've got to be looking at. There are some penalties involved. At the moment, I don't have at my fingertips what those penalties are. The penalties, though, are unchanged. But I do think the next chapter of this is enforcement. A law is only good as its enforcement. You can have a lot of laws on the books and not have real enforcement. So rest assured, we're going to continue our discussions with the state and how this is enforced and make sure that it's enforced. So we're going to be very vigorous in that regard.
Now, the modifications in this law now go beyond the graphic presentations like the paintings and things, sculpture and things like that, and now includes visual, performing arts, or literature now. Why was that included?
Well, look, native art is an evolving thing. We're not frozen in time, and our people have found ways to express themselves and identify culturally through different mediums and through the performing arts. And so we thought it appropriate for the law to evolve, just as our artists have evolved in terms of the various media. So it did include that. There was no pushback that we could tell from members of the House or the Senate on that expansion. I think it's just a recognition that Indian art is broad and it's evolving, and that's a good thing to recognize.
In my experience in covering stories involving Indian arts and crafts fairs and things like that, one thing I've understood among their organizers, most of them keep fairly stringent guidelines as far as who is eligible to participate. Now, will this law have any effect on those kinds of things, crafts fairs, art shows, things like that?
Purely on how something is labeled. I can think example where a private museum had a piece of art that had for years been displayed as Cherokee art, and before this law was passed, again, this isn't in the marketplace of selling art, but this is an example of how a museum handled it. They changed the label from Cherokee art to American art to when it was revealed that this person was not a Cherokee, and that was an appropriate change. So I can imagine at an art show to the extent that this law applies, again, to the extent the state has jurisdiction over that particular art show, it's merely the labeling. So people are still free to participate in the bounds of the rules of the art show, but it's merely about labeling. And I think there's ways to label art in a way that's respectful of the artist, because, look, there's a lot of great art out there that's produced in the sort of Native American traditions that's done by people who aren't citizens of tribes, and we don't begrudge those folks from entering contests and selling their art. It's really just about labeling. And we found when we raised this issue that tribes all across the state, Indian artists all across the state, really connected with this idea that it's really a truth in labeling law, and so we got a lot of support in that regard.
Right, that phrase actually popped up in my head, and I was thinking, well, let's ask him about that one. What has been the reaction from the artists that you know there in the Cherokee Nation and perhaps elsewhere? What have they had any reaction at all? I know the law is brand new, but the discussion is old.
Yeah, the discussion is old. The law is brand new. And when we made the push this spring in the legislature, I mean, we looked to the artists for some leadership, and boy, they provided it. And there was a day at the Capitol, I think it was maybe middle of April, maybe early May, where we invited a number of artists to the state capitol, and they were artists that came from all different tribes. Those that couldn't show up in person sent letters. And so we had a lot of different tribes represented in that effort. And we had really positive response. Where we had some pushback was very limited, and it was among some artists who had identified as Native American who weren't citizens of a federally recognized tribe. And I think, quite naturally, they looked at it as something that would impact them personally, and we certainly didn't begrudge them from raising the issue and raising their points. But by and large, Indian artists were very encouraged by this. I think they liked the fact that they had someone fighting for them on this issue, because they go to art shows, they see their art displayed in retail shops, and they no doubt get discouraged when they see someone who is just not an Indian competing against them, because they know their history. They know their family history and their tribe's history, and I know that on many levels it had to hurt them. So I think they were encouraged when they found that not just my father, Chuck Hoskins Sr., but also Senator John Sparks, also a citizen of the Cherokee Nation, see those two guys go to bat for them, see the other members of the legislature sign on as supporters, see the Cherokee Nation take a leadership role in pushing it, see some other tribes step forward, other chiefs. We had Osage Nation, Creek Nation, Sac and Fox, Wichita, Eastern Shawnee, and we had a lot of folks. That's just a few. We had a lot of folks, a lot of tribes represented. So I think the artists were really encouraged, and they enjoyed getting the opportunity to rally for something that was very meaningful to them.
I'm curious now as to how you're going to get the word out. Is there going to be some sort of, let's call it a promotional campaign, saying if you come to Oklahoma, you better be able to prove it?
I think that's a good idea. I think we, number one, we need to keep this conversation going with the state about enforcement and about, as you say, spreading the word. We're gonna be optimistic that the state is going to not only follow through, not just putting this on the books, but putting it into action, and that also takes the form of some public relations on their part. But I think tribes have a role too. We have thought about having an authentic Native American Art Day in Cherokee Nation to try to locally raise awareness of this new law. And I think that's something tribes across the state can do in their own way to say, look, we've got a new, strong state law that will protect and honor our Indian artists, and let's tell the world about it. So I think there's more work to be done in that regard.
That raised a real quick question in my mind. Do you think this could be a possibility of some sort of lawsuit saying, well, under federal law I can call myself an Indian, but under state law you can't?
I suppose somebody may take that tact. We feel we're on the firmest of legal grounds. Of course, when a bill is introduced in the state legislature, it gets reviewed by their own counsel. There's a guarantee there won't be a lawsuit, but it gives those who are advocating for it peace of mind that there's been a set of legal eyes on it, and that it appears to be lawful. We feel absolutely 100% confident that the state of Oklahoma, as it's had since 1974 and before that, the right to regulate the labeling of art within its borders, and this is what this law does. And so if there's a challenge, I think it would be swiftly disposed of in our favor, but certainly people have a right to seek the courts.
All right, in the last few minutes we have here, a couple of minutes here, as a final word, if there was a way you could describe this law. Oh, by the way, is it in effect right now?
It goes in effect in November.
Okay. Now, a final way to capsulize a description of this new law, if you were asked to do that in a short phrase or even a word, what would it be?
Sure. It protects and honors the Indian artist in the state, and it protects and honors the consumers of Indian art in the state, put simply. I mean, this law will make sure that when someone comes into our state and wants to purchase Indian art, they will have confidence that it is genuine Indian art. And when one of our artists, we have so many great artists in our tribes in this state, when they're producing and selling art, they can have confidence that they're entering into a marketplace that is fair, that all the sacrifices of their ancestors mean something very special, and that when they produce art, they can proudly label it as Native American art in this state. And that's a big win for the artist, and it's a big win for consumers.
Yes, and for our state, Native America. Well, yes. Mr. Chuck Hoskins, we want to say wadon. We appreciate you taking time to chat with us about this new law. I'm sure we're going to hear lots more about it as it goes into effect and has its impact on art shows here in Oklahoma.
Wado, my friend, and thank you so much for covering the issue.
Okay, well, you'll probably hear from me again, so don't let it get dusty there.
Sounds good.
All right, thank you, sir. We're going to take a real short pause here, and then we'll be back with some community announcements, so stay with us here on Mvskoke Radio.
Who am I? Am I Indian? Just 'cause I'm a girl from the res, don't make things up about me. What if I move away? Then who am I? Some kids try meth just to escape, but then I think about my grandma, my little brother, my beadwork, my poetry, and I think, I like who I am, and I know meth is not for me.
Check out ncai.org, a message from the Partnership for a Drug-Free America and the National Congress of American Indians.
Okay, in some of our community announcements, the tourism and recreation folks say that the splash pad at the Claude Cox Omniplex will be closed until further notice so that their construction crews can remediate a water leak and draining issues. And we'll get you word when that very popular new installation is available again. The Mvskoke Farmers Market, hosted by the Wellness Council, will be having their market there on July the 15th from 11 to 3 at the Vendors Pavilion on the Omniplex Fairgrounds, so you want to check that out. Once again, it's July 15th from 11 to 1:30. And I hope you've reserved your spot, because if you haven't, you're out of luck. Coming up real quick is the Mvskoke March 2016 from the tribal capital to the state capital. It's a youth-led and youth-driven initiative to create awareness about teen dating violence here in Indian country and Mvskoke Nation. The council's traveling with the National Indian Tribal Youth Conference folks in Oklahoma City there. It will start on July the 18th at noon with a rally and a prayer here at the National Council House here in downtown Okmulgee. So if you're interested, check them out on the 18th at noon, and for more information, visit MvskokeMarch2016.weebly.com. A reminder that the Mvskoke Creek Nation Community Clinic is available. You can get care there here in town in Okmulgee from Monday through Friday, 8 to 12, 1 to 5, 918-756-5471. All right, well, that's it for Mvskoke Radio here in this week. I want to say Mado Mabo Hedgetskud. Appreciate it. Gary Fife, Jeho Jifkado. You've been listening to Mvskoke Radio. Join us again next week for more local, tribal, and community news and updates. Mado.